I'm Cardiff Garcia of FT Alphaville. I'm here with Dan Drezner, Professor of International Relations at Tufts University. He's the author of the recently published The System Worked, but he's also the author of an earlier book on economic sanctions called The Sanctions Paradox. We're going to be talking about that and the situation with Russia right now. Okay, Dan, I want to start, before we get to the particulars of what's happening with Russia, with something that you wrote not long ago, which is that something's changed, that what matters now in terms of sanctions isn't how punitive they are, but how the private sector and the economy react. So talk about that.
Right. So, I mean, one of the points I was making is that, we think of sanctions in terms of what was legally, imposed in terms of trade restrictions or freezing of assets and so on and so forth. And that's the way that conventionally a lot of people talk about this. But what's increasingly happening is that, the economy has become so globalized, and investors tend to be pretty risk averse when it comes to geopolitical considerations, that if a country is under threat of sanction by the United States and the European Union, that causes money to leave because they don't necessarily want to get trapped there, and because they also think that that economy is going to be suffering potentially from economic stagnation. Furthermore, in the case of Russia in particular, the idea that Vladimir Putin is willing to use military force to get what he wants and sort of ignore the rule of law, let's say, that's got to be disconcerting to private sector investors as well. Sure.
And by the way, I mean, capital has already started leaving Russia.
Yeah.
The economy is stagnant at best.
Right.
On the other hand, Putin's still very popular. There's been this, they've been amassing troops on the border with eastern Ukraine. I mean, things are very tense going into the weekend right now. And so I guess my first question is this a kind of waiting game? Does it take a while for sanctions to work? And what can we hope for the outcome to be now?
Sanctions tend to work in one of two ways. The first is that ideally the targeted state or targeted leader recognizes what the potential costs are and will acquiesce relatively quickly before actually incurring any of those actual costs. In the case of Putin and Russia, though, I think they would have been genuinely surprised at the effect even the sort of pinprick sanctions that the US and the EU originally imposed actually had on the Russian economy. And so in this case also, because what Vladimir Putin was doing was appealing to nationalism, and because he's so domestically politically popular, he can ride this out for a while. But the thing about what we call rally around the flag effects, where some sort of crisis causes a domestic population to rally behind its leader, is that those do tend to fade over time. At which point people start paying more attention to things like, well, do I have a job? And
food costs more money.
Food costs more money, and so on and so forth. So, remember that before all of this, in 2012, there were protests in the streets about Vladimir Putin running for a third term for president.
Right.
It would not be shocking if, 6 months from now, if the situation hasn't really changed in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, suddenly Vladimir Putin is not necessarily looking as popular.
Okay. What about the specific way that the U.S. and the Europeans have gone about imposing sanctions? They started with sort of travel bans, asset freezes. After the downing of the Malaysian Airlines flight kind of galvanized public opinion against Russia, they got a little bit more aggressive, and then the Russians retaliated. Was that the right way to go about it? And if not, how should they think about it going ahead?
I think the way that the United States and Europe have thought about it is that they've been constantly trying to signal. The best sanctions, in some ways, the most powerful ones, are the ones that you never impose. They're the ones you threaten that seem pretty serious, but that you don't actually have to impose, much like the threat of military power as well. And I think what the United States in particular, and the European Union in particular, have been trying to do is to signal to Putin, if you continue to go down this road, there will be more and more.
Will escalate. It'll get worse and worse.
Right. So the first round of sanctions were pretty modest. They were only targeting, individuals and a few entities. The fact that we've now shifted to sectoral sanctions suggests that this is actually going to be more serious, and it really is going to hurt Russia's economy. And the fascinating thing, truthfully, is the way Putin responded, which is with these agricultural sanctions. There's no other way to put this. This hurts the Russian consumer a lot more than it hurts European exporters. It hurts them, but it really hurts the Russians more.
Sure.
And it again suggests the way in which, for Putin, this is as much a game about domestic symbols as it is about economics.
So your take on this so far is not that Russia's a threat because it's been so successful in managing the situation in Ukraine, but actually because it's been such a catastrophic failure.
Yes.
This is an opinion that I think is shared by people within the FT, my colleague Gideon Rachman as well, and that actually makes Putin more dangerous now rather than less. So talk about how we should be interpreting his options now.
So here's the thing. I mean, Vladimir Putin has come up with this grand new idea of Novorossiya, the idea that it's in Russia's interest to protect ethnic Russians elsewhere, and that they've been persecuted and so on and so forth, and that he will be the savior for them. And that played pretty well in Crimea. I mean, they were able to take over Crimea without basically really firing a shot. It was a pretty bloodless annexation. But that's not the way it's gone in eastern Ukraine. And furthermore, what's gone in eastern Ukraine has also led to real costs in terms of the Russian economy. Right. So the question now is that, given that Putin and his propaganda machine have pumped up this notion of it is our job to defend, Russians elsewhere, and given the fact that the Ukrainian army has now seized something like 2/3 of the territory that the rebels had held, and it looks like they've encircled Donetsk. Right. The question now is, where can Putin go? If he backs down now after all of this propaganda, good propagandists can try to find a way for a graceful exit, but it's not going to be that easy. In some ways, politically, he's almost gone down a road that he is not necessarily going to want to get off. His better thing to do is just to continue to try to bully through.
Particularly problematic would be if his loyalists actually believe the propaganda, right?
Right.
This isn't just a PR strategy.
Right. In international relations theory, we call this blowback, where you are literally trapped by your own rhetoric. And Putin is trapped by his own rhetoric. And so as a result, I think it'll be interesting to see, how the West tries to come up with some way. I mean, the Obama administration has continued to talk about things like exit ramps for, Putin to get off of a road that goes towards more continued conflict. It's possible that what Putin thinks he has to do now is just maintain the conflict. The real problem for him, though, is that since the rebels in eastern Ukraine are still losing, right, at some point he's going to have a choice of, does in fact the regular Russian army intervene or not? And in some ways, that might be even an escalation too far for him. Sure. But he's, without question, painted himself into a corner.
Okay, you recently suggested a preferred solution, at least in the short term, which is to get UN peacekeepers, the guys with the blue hats, on the ground there. In other words, not this idea that Putin has now of getting his own guys in there with the Red Cross, and not the Ukrainian idea of having certain windows of time during which people can leave, but actually getting the UN in place there and sort of, coming between the two. Talk about the benefits of this idea and specifically what Putin's incentive would be for going along with something like this.
So let me be clear. I think this has maybe a 2% chance of success.
Sure.
I'm not saying this is the solution for everything. But the notion is that if you actually get UN peacekeepers in there, and the peacekeepers would be from countries without a significant strategic stake in the regions, so from sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia or what have you. Once you actually get UN peacekeepers into place, they tend to reduce the likelihood that the war would actually flare up again. The conflict would be frozen, which would, the first and most important thing is actually cause fewer people to die. It would also potentially give Putin a graceful exit, because he could then say, I have protected ethnic Russians because I made sure that there was a UN peacekeeping force in place that will prevent, the atrocities that the fascist government in Kiev has done, and so on and so forth.
Everybody goes home and declares victory, basically.
Right. The real loser would, in fact, be the Ukrainian government. But even the Ukrainian government, you could argue, might have an incentive to do this, because they've reclaimed a lot of territory over the last month. But that was sort of agricultural area and smaller towns. Retaking Donetsk and Luhansk is going to be bloody. Sure. And it's possible that by agreeing to this, they prevent an assault that would lose a lot of lives and actually cause some blowback in Ukraine as well.
Okay, let's close with the much broader issue of just the use of sanctions as a foreign policy tool. When you wrote your first book, this was 1999, sorry to date you a little bit, they were lame. Nobody wanted to use them, right? It was kind of, this was not, all of a sudden in the last, 5-10 years, they've become more popular. Right. In Iran, we saw that they may have, contributed to at least a kind of easing of tensions there. I mean, talk about sort of the evolution of sanctions as a foreign policy tool.
I think the thing that's happened over the last 10 or 15 years was essentially 9/11, and the notion that rather than just imposing sort of blanket trade embargoes, like let's say the case of Iraq after the first Persian Gulf War, you saw the development of what were called smarter sanctions, and particularly sanctions that targeted the financial system. And particularly over the last 10 years, those sanctions have really actually started to have real-world, significant implications, not on the target's economy, particularly the target's elite. And so as a result, I think the US and to a lesser extent the European Union have been genuinely surprised at the ways in which these sanctions have sometimes gotten countries like Iran to the negotiating table when they didn't necessarily have high hopes for that. Sure. So as a result, there's now a sort of new enthusiasm that sanctions will solve everything, which is great because no one really wants to use force and so forth. And it's funny because you're right, in the 1999 book I was trying to argue sanctions are actually sometimes more useful than you realize. It sort of depends on the expectations of future conflict.
Context dependent.
Right, exactly. And now I'm much more on the other side of warning people, you know, sanctions won't do everything. It's great that suddenly you're all enthusiastic, but they're not necessarily going to cause regime change in Iran, and I don't think they're going to cause regime change in Russia either. So, you know,
sort of gradual behavioral change is what you can hope for, and that's not nothing, right?
No, it's not nothing. And the most important sort of lesson for sanctions in some ways is the most banal, which is you have to know what is the demand you're going to ask for in the beginning that will actually cause the sanctions to be lifted. Part of the issue in the case of Iran and Iraq has always been, were the sanctions targeted at things like WMD use or proliferation, or are they targeted at regime change? And that's the question you have to ask if you're going to impose sanctions, which is your goal to change the targeted country's behavior, or is it to change the targeted country's regime? The latter is a lot more difficult than the former.
All right. Dan Drezner, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
If you want to see more, go to ft.com or ftalphaville.ft.com. Click on the links below, and thanks for watching.